Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this event. This is the EFSA webinar on the calculator for the estimation of non-dietary exposure to plant protection products, the so-called OPEX Calculator. We have received lots of interest in this event with almost 600 registrations, so I hope it will be really useful. Next slide, please. My name is Arianna Chiusolo. I'm a scientific officer in the pesticide peer review unit of EFSA. I'm now introducing the event and some technical information on the webinar. Then my colleague Frederick Stas will present an overview on the OPEX calculator functionalities and some practical examples. After this, in a short question and answer session, my colleague Matilde Colas will present the questions received at the registrations with a prepared answer. And then at the end, I will close the event with some follow-up information. The participants can ask questions whenever during the webinar using the chat. Question will be addressed directly in the chat box by the contributors that are listed in this slide, namely Jose Cortinas from EFSA and the external experts Dagmar Bemelmans, Denise Bloch, Sabine Martin, Paul Hamey, and Peter Craig. Questions will be addressed as much as possible, of course, depending on the number of questions received and considering also the large attendance we have. To this point, I would recommend the participant to submit questions that are pertinent to the topic of the event, so the functionalities of the OPEX calculator. Please focus your question on this topic. Other questions, for instance, related to the amendments in the OPEC guidance and clarification, or its implementation and future updates, will be considered out of the scope. Next slide, please. And with this slide, I want to give you a short webinar guide. So first of all, the webinar is going to be recorded. The language is English, therefore also questions should be submitted in English. Please, as said, use the chat box on your right for submitting questions at any moment. Once addressed the questions by the contributors, both the questions that you have submitted and the answer will be visible to all in the chat box. You are, as you can see, automatically connected to the audio with the listening mode. So now I leave the floor to Frederick to present the functionalities of the OPEX calculator. And next slide, please.
Okay. Good morning to all of you. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Frederick Stas, Scientific Officer in the Pesticide Unit in EFSA, and I will present you the functionalities of the calculator. So first, I will give some historical background. I will present you how to access the calculator, and then I will give some practical examples with the online tool. Next slide, please. Thank you. As historical background, you know, the first EFSA guidance on the non-dietary exposure assessment of operators, workers, residents, and bystanders was published in 2014. And it was including an Excel calculator with scenarios for outdoor uses, also some worker re-entry scenarios in greenhouses, and it included different risk mitigation measures, protective equipment, technical equipment, buffer zones. And these were the first EU-validated approaches for non-dietary exposure assessment. A few years after the publication of this guidance, EFSA received a mandate for an update. Next slide, please. And this first update has been published in 2022. As a new scenarios in the update, we have now greenhouse scenario, also for operators, resident and bystanders, so not only for workers. It includes also a revision of some crop and human parameters based on an updated status of knowledge. And it is offering a new online calculator with improved functionalities that I will show you afterwards, with a manual of formulas that are used in the calculations. And it has also an impact assessment in Annex E of the guidance as described. Next slide, please. So first, I will explain you how to access this new calculator. So you go first to the link on the EFSA website, as it is presented here. And then you can see you have two options. Either you read the article online or you access the PDF. If you choose to access the PDF, you will be able to download the document and read it on your own computer. Whereas if you choose the option read the article, next slide please, you will be able to access the online guidance where going to the different sections, you can have an overview of the sections when you click on this button. You will see that you have supporting information. And in this supporting information, next slide please, you will have the different annexes to the guidance. So you see Annex A, B, C, D, E, F, J. And in the Annex E, you will have all the explanations about the new calculator, including the links to the different documents that are available. So among the links that you can find in this Annex E, you have the link to the calculator itself, but you have also the link to the manual with the formulations and the link to the relevant R package used in the tool. So when you use the link to the calculator for the first time, for your first access, you will need to register. Then the following access, you will use the password that you have entered as after registration. Next slide, please. Then the other link that you can find in Annex E, as I told you, are for the manual and for the R package. You can see the two red bullets on the left side of the screen for the two documents. And on the right side of the screen, you can see the first page of the manual. I can show you a bit more how is the manual. So on the next slide, please. So you see here an extract of the table of content of the manual for the operator. You have the description, you have several divisions. So for solubles or granules formulation, for outdoor, indoor uses, and then for each of them, you have the different scenarios under consideration for which all the formulas are given. So I will show you in the next slide, please. How are these formulas? As example, you can see here some formulas for operators. And these formulas are giving estimates of external exposure. And then below, you will have for the details of the further calculations for correction for absorption, thermal inhalation, for correction for additional protection, personal protective equipment or respiratory protective equipment. And then you will have explanation on how everything is summed up and compared to the toxicological reference values. Next slide, please. And in the manual, you can see here the rest of the table of content. You have also the same explanations and formulas available for worker, resident, and bystander, divided the same way for solubles and granules, and then for outdoor or indoor uses. And so for worker, you see the different scenarios available, and for resident as well as bystander, you have the same 4 exposure pathways than in the previous calculator. So spray drift, vapor, surface deposit, and entry into treated crops, as well as recreational exposure as a separate scenario. Next slide, please. And also important, in this manual, you can find an appendix. And in this appendix, you have different tables with showing all combinations and default values that are used in the calculations. You have here an example of a table for worker. You can see that according to the crop type, you have different re-entry activities that are possible and combined. With the default duration of exposure, body parts that are exposed, and the different transfer coefficient with or without use of personal protective equipment. And as well for resident and bystanders, you have different tables with default values that are used in the calculation. Slide, please. And after this introduction to the links and supporting documents, we can start with the presentation of the calculator itself and its functionalities. So you can see here the icon that will appear when you will open the link to the calculator after your first registration. Next slide, please. And in this calculator, you will see a nice toolbar with different tabs. You see you have the info tab, data entry tab, summary, operator, worker, resident, and bystander. And let's look at the first tab first, the info tab. In this info sheet, you can find a description of all registers. You can find also the technical documentation, so information on the R package that is used in this version of the calculator, the legend of all the icons that are used in the calculator, also the meaning of all abbreviations that are used in the calculator, and background data. I will show you with more illustration during the practical examples what you can find in the info sheet. Next tab, please. Next slide, please. Something I think important and useful, because this was also a request, the explanation of all personal protective equipment is given in the info sheet. So even if it does not appear in the result of the calculator, you can find in the info sheet all this information, as well as the protection factors that are related to each of them in further tables. Next slide, please. So after this info sheet, where you also find all instructions on how to enter the data that I will explain now, you have the data entry tab. In this data entry tab, you have 4 sheets for data entry. You need to enter data for the product, for the active substance, for the application scenarios, and for the intended uses. So we'll start with the product on the next slide, please. Okay, so you can see for the product, you can also use a product that you have already saved earlier. So the first option, load saved product. Or you can enter a new product name. Then you need to choose the formulation type that is under consideration. So as you have already seen in the manual of formulation, you have solubles and non-solubles, which are granules. And on the next cell on the right side, you can choose if you use water-soluble bags, if the product is formulated into water-soluble bags or not. It's only here that you can choose this option, not later in the other entry sheet. And then you choose the product category, herbicide or other. Other can be fungicide, insecticide, etc. Next slide, please. Then when you have entered all the data for your product, so only one product can be entered at a time in the calculator, you have a summary of this data appearing on the right side. If you are happy with this data, you can go to the next entry sheet by clicking on the arrow on the upper right side of the window. Next slide, please. And you go to the second data entry sheet for the active substance. So of course, you start by writing the name of the active substance, and then you need to enter the concentration of the active substance. The concentration is expressed as technical material, meaning the material that has been used in the toxicity studies to derive the AOEL and the AAOEL. It's not the pure active substance, it's the technical material. Then AOEL, AOEL are the toxicological reference values. The next cell on the right is vapor pressure. The default value appearing is 0.001. If you delete this value, no results will be shown for exposure to vapor. You should know that the same trigger value applies than in the previous calculator. So we have two default values for air concentration, depending on the vapor pressure, which are 1 microgram per cubic meter and 15 microgram per cubic meter. And it depends if the vapor pressure is above or below 5 multiplied by 10 minus 3 pascals. But then I will explain at the end of this slide how this can be refined in the calculations. Then the second part of this data entry sheet for the active substance is for thermal absorption. So in this table, the concentration of the active substance that you have introduced above will automatically be reported in the first column on the first line. If you have or you do not have experimental data for the concentrate, you need to enter here manually the value of the thermal absorption. So if you have experimental data, this will be the value from the thermal absorption study. If you have no experimental data, it will be the default value, but you have to enter it yourself. And then in the second lines, you have the different dilutions tested in the thermal absorption study when it is available with respective thermal absorption values that you need to enter. So here you enter only results from experimental study or the default for the concentrate. You will see later in the intended use when you have no experimental study where you have to enter the thermal absorption values for the dilution. It will be in one of the next sheets. Then, in relationship with the vapor pressure that I mentioned earlier, we have here as a last possibility on this sheet, the air concentration calculation. This is optional. If you do not enter any low and might trigger a lower air concentration than the default value of 1 microgram per cubic meter, the lowest, you can enter the true value of the vapor pressure in the cell above, and then in this cell below, you enter the molecular weight of the active substance. And the calculator will calculate the saturated vapor concentration. And if the value is lower than the default value, it will be used in the next calculation. But if it's above the default value, it will not be used in the calculation. So don't be surprised if there is no change in exposure by inhalation, even though you have filled in these cells, because it depends on the results. Next slide, please. So when you have entered all the data for this for one active substance, you click on the Add button, and you can enter other data for a second active substance, for a third. I mean, several active substances in the same product can be assessed in the tool for combined exposure. And you see also on this line that on the right side of this screen, of this overview table, you can decide to delete one entry or to modify it. And then if you modify it, it will go back in the upper part of the screen. You will need to re-enter to change the data you want to modify and to push on the Add button again. And it will come back in the overview table with the changes you have made. Next slide, please. So after data entries for the product and active substance, we come to the data entry for the application scenario. So at first, you need to select the crop. So you have a predefined list of crops, of crop groups, and you need to choose. Once you have chosen your crop group of interest, you see that different examples of crop type and crop specific crops will appear below. So you will be able to check if the crop you are interested in is included in this group, in these examples. Next slide, please. Then always for the application scenarios, the next cell is you have to choose between indoor and outdoor use. Once you have chosen this, the next one is the re-entry activity. You see here, for this example, for outdoor uses, we have one cell for re-entry activity, and you need to choose a re-entry activity among the ones proposed in a predefined list. And once you have chosen this re-entry activity, you will see just below the crop examples that the dermal transfer coefficients for workers that are applicable to this re-entry activity will appear. Because these are default values, cannot be changed in the calculator, but you are informed here of which default values are used in the next calculations for this use. Then after the data related to the crop, you need to enter data for the application rate. Here, there is a big difference compared to the previous calculator. And this difference is that you have to enter the maximum application rate of the product and not of the active substance. Because the application rate as active substance will be calculated in the tool with previous data that you have already entered about the product. Here, it's the amount of product that has to be entered. And you can choose a number of application, interval between, if you choose more than one application, the cell with an interval between application will appear and you can adjust it. The default is 7, but you can adjust. Then you have the type of cultivation, the minimum volume of water. I think I gave, next slide, please. More example on this on the next slide. Yeah, maximum volume of water. So the minimum volume of water is used for the exposure estimates, while the maximum volume of water is used within the tool to calculate the thermal absorption if the experimental value that has been tested is not the same as the highest dilution from the use, then there will be a pro rata correction already done in the calculator, according to the EFSA guidance on thermal absorption of 2017. Then the last section of this data entry for the application scenario is the method of application. So you can usually downward, upward spraying is automatically selected according to your previous choice of crop or herbicide. For example, when you select at the beginning at the product level herbicide, it will always be downward application. While if you select other type of herbicide or other type of product and a high crop category like orchards, you will have upwards application available. And on the in the next cell, you have the application technique. And here you can see that there are 3 application techniques, but you can select only one of them if you are interested to see the results of only vehicle-mounted application, for example. The others can be deleted. Otherwise, the results are shown for all the 3 application techniques. And then, as in the previous calculator, you can choose the buffer strip to 3 meter, 5 meter, 10 meter, and the default drift reduction value also is the same as in the previous calculator. It's 50%. Next slide, please. Here, I wanted to show you an example of indoor use. So for the previous application scenario, I show you outdoor use. There was one re-entry activity for worker, While you see here, in the case of indoor use, you have also a second cell for reentry activity, TSF, and this one is related to exposure by inhalation, because for workers re-entering greenhouses, we have also, the calculator is also providing exposure estimates by inhalation. And these TSF factors were also included in the previous EFSA calculator, so for worker re-entry in greenhouse. And you see that for indoor use, the type of cultivation can be normal or dense, while in the case of outdoor use, it's always normal, but for greenhouse, it can also be dense. And all the rest of the cells are the same for indoor use. Next slide, please. So when you have added this application scenario, by clicking on the Add button, you can see below the overview of the different uses that you have entered in the tool, and they are numbered, use number 1, use number 2. And you can see here the difference. The first one, it was for outdoor use, the second one for indoor use on low vegetables. And you can see all the different combinations, so that here all application techniques were kept, so the results will be shown for all these application techniques. Then once you have finalized your application scenario, again, you go on the arrow on the upper right side of the screen to go to the next sheet of data entry. And this last sheet of data entry is for the intended use. In this long table of intended use, it is here that you can enter the thermal absorption value, the default thermal absorption value for the dilution when you have no experimental data. So you see that you have this tick box. In this case, it is activated. Experimental data, yes, because we had entered value in the entry sheet for the active substance. So these values are used and reported here. While if you had no experimental data, you would need to untick the box here and enter manually the value for the thermal absorption of the dilution. If you scroll on the right side of the screen of this table of intended use, next slide, please. You will see that for the worker, the resident, and the bystander, you can also modify manually DFR, DT50 values when you have experimental data. That will substitute the default values that are shown here. As you can see, in this new calculator, different DT50 values have been implemented. So one for the foliar, the same as in the previous calculator. One for the air, DT50 air, for the inhalation exposure, and one for the soil, for the exposure to soil-borne residue. And they are used in the calculation of the safe re-entry intervals for workers. Next slide, please. So when you have entered all these data and checked the intended use, you come back to the first page of the data entry, and a big advice now is save your product. It is better to save your product once you have entered all the data, and you will see it will appear as a zip file that you can download. So no need to unzip it, you have to save it as such. Because then when you will need to load again the data into the calculator, you use directly the zip file. And in this summary, you see first an overview of all the data in this first page. With the summary, you see you have an overview of all the data you have entered for the product, for the active substance, and when you go below for the application scenario and intended use. Next slide, please. Okay, and in the summary, you will also be able to generate a report. So you see here, you have the two buttons. First, generate the report, and then when you will have a message from the tool, and it will tell you when the report is ready, and then the download report button will be activated, and you will be able to download it. So for the summary, you need first to choose which use you are interested in seeing the results. So in this case, we had only 2 uses, so low vegetables. You have to remember the first one, it was for outdoor uses. The second one, it was for indoor uses. And the season, in the case of low vegetables, is not a relevant parameter. So you have the option below this first choice table to see the results for the summary results for operator, worker, resident, and bystander. Next slide, please. Or if you just scroll down, you will see all the results. For the operator, they will be shown as a short exposure first, short-term exposure, % of AOEL, and then acute exposure, % of AAOEL. You will have the results for all active substance that you have entered in the product. Here we had 2, the active substance 1 and active substance 2. And you will see that these tables of results in the summary are also colored. I mean, the color has a meaning. When it is red, it is when the exposure estimate is above the AOEL or the AAOEL. When it is green, you see on the second line of the first table on the right side, it is when only workwear and no other specific protective equipment needs to be used to have an exposure estimate below the AOEL. And when the cells are orange, it is when you need additional protective equipment or respiratory protective equipment to the standard workwear. Next slide, please. And when you scroll down after the specific separated exposure to each active substance, you can see the combined exposure to both active substance. Well, you have to take care. The combined exposure is not expressed as the individual exposure because here it is expressed as hazard index and not as % of AOEL. The hazard index is the sum of hazard quotients, and the hazard quotients are the ratio of the exposure to the AOEL for each active substance. So it's not the same value as a percentage. Next slide, please. Then if you scroll down to this summary tab, in this summary tab, you can see the results for the worker, for the active substance 1, active substance 2, and also combined exposure. And as an additional functionality of this calculator, you can see in the last column that you have also a safe reentry interval that is provided. So you see for the third line of the first table that you need 31 days to have an exposure during reentry below the AOEL. Next slide, please. And for the resident and bystander, you will have the same results. So presented separately for each active substance, for adult residents and children residents, and combined exposure expressed as hazard index for adults and children. And you see also here the same color code, green when it is below the AOEL and red when it is above the AOEL. Next slide, please. And for the bystander, you have the results are presented similarly, except you have only the 4 pathways of exposure presented separately. You do not have the mean of all pathways because this is not applicable to bystander. It is the same approach as in the previous calculator. Next slide, please. Then going back to the toolbar of the calculator. After data entry and summarized data, you can go to more detailed data first for the operator. And you see, as in the summary, you have to choose first which use is of interest for you. You want to see the results. And when you have chosen this use, you can see that different scenarios appear, meaning that in this case, I had kept the different application techniques. So you have one line by application technique for each active substance. So in total, the number of lines can be quite high. In the next slide, please, then you go all these different lines, you can select one of them. So here I had chosen the second use on low vegetables, indoor, and you can see also that different application technique are multiplying the number of rows for which you can see the results. And if you choose, for example, the last line for indoor manual knapsack application in dense cultivations, you can see more results on the next slide. Okay, for the single scenario, so the one you have chosen. So once you choose a line in this table, it appears immediately below the table. And you can see here the minimum level of protective equipment needed to have an exposure below the AOEL or AAOEL. And if you scroll down these first results, on the next slide, please, you can see all combinations of PPE. So the first table was the minimum level of protective equipment needed to have a safe exposure, but then below you have the results presented for all combinations of protective equipment. And then you have to choose if it's for short-term exposure or acute exposure. In this case, I've chosen acute exposure, and you see the table of results. In this case, there is not a lot of equipment because only with workwear and gloves we could reach an exposure below the AOEL for the first uses, for the first application techniques. And next slide, please. And then you have also the detailed results for the worker. And it is the same as for operator. You need to choose the use. You can select one single line of the different scenarios to have a single scenario. In the case of worker, you see now that inhalation exposure is appearing, but as this one, the first use, if you remember, it was an outdoor use, inhalation exposure is not taken into account. But in case of indoor uses, you will have the value appearing here. And at the end of this single scenario results, you see the safe calculation of the safe reentry interval will appear. On the next slide, please. And going down in this tab for the worker results, you will see the combined exposure to the different active substance in a product. You can see you can choose result per substance or combined exposure. And the hazard index is also is presented here, and safe reentry interval is also calculated for the combined exposure. Next slide, please. Then I wanted to show you here, yes, a specific scenario for a worker that has been implemented in the calculator is reentry on bare arable land. So 2 reentry activities have been implemented: contact with treated soil. In this case, exposure to soil-borne residue is calculated, and inspection without contact with treated soil. And you see that for this one, there is difference between outdoor and indoor use, because in the case of outdoor uses, you see all parameters are not applicable, so it is considered that there is no exposure of the worker, while for indoor use, you have at least exposure to vapor by inhalation, which is taken into account. Next slide, please. Then after the detailed results for the worker, we have results for the resident, and it is the same. You choose the use you want to see the results. You can select the single line of interest to see immediately below the table, or you scroll down. Next slide, please, to see more results. And you see here, you can select, in the previous slide, I show you the button combined exposure, and here I've chosen the button per substance, so you can see the detailed results for each active substance. Next slide, please. And for resident, to shortly illustrate, we have also the use on amenity grassland triggering recreational exposure. And as you can see, this appears as an additional scenario of, to the traditional 4 pathways of exposure. So it is considered separately, but the results are provided here. Next slide, please. And finally, the last tab in this toolbar is for the bystander results. And again, the same presentation. So once you have understood, it will be easy. You choose the use of interest, of your interest, the scenario you want to see the result, if you want to see immediately the results, or you scroll down to see the result of all scenario that will appear for single active substance or for combined exposure. Next slide, please. And finally, when you are, let's say, happy with the calculation provided and you want to print them or to keep a record, in the Summary tab, you can find the option Generate a Report, and then you will have the message on the low right angle of the screen, creating report, please wait. And then when the report is ready, you will also have the message that the report is ready. It can take a few seconds, be patient. And once it is ready, the button Download Report will be active, and you will be able to download the Word document that is produced by the calculator. And you see here how it will appear, but I can show you in the examples how it is really designed. Next slide, please. So this was for the introduction to the functionalities of the calculator. So now I will share my screen to show you live real examples on the calculator. So just the time to share it. Okay, a few seconds and you should be all able to see it. Okay, I think now you all see it. So this is the first page of the calculator. I will refresh it because as my presentation was quite long, now it needs to be refreshed, reactivated in order to avoid to have any bugs, because there is a timeout, and once it remains inactive too long, you need to use the refresh button. So you can see in the info sheet I already described you the data entry, how to enter the data. You can even download an example of a product to see how the data have been entered, to see how the report is generated, and so on. And I think I mentioned to you some background information that are also interesting. I scroll down to show you. You see here, technical documentation. You have some information on the R package. Then you have the icons legend that I showed you already in my slides. Then you have the abbreviation and the background data. These are quite interesting because they represent all default values and combinations used in the calculator. You see here default values. Then you can have the value of the protection correction factors. You have the combination of the application equipment according to the crop and the personal protective equipment. You see all combinations of personal protective equipment have been predefined in the calculator, so you cannot change. You cannot choose only gloves during application and no gloves during mixing loading, but it might appear. I mean, we have done a lot of combinations that should cover most of the needs and which are logical. I mean, we started with gloves and then adding respiratory at the next step. You see, protecting hands first during mixing loading. We try to develop this combination list in a logical order. And you have then the formulations from for the outdoor models, for the indoor models with the different coefficients. And you have the thermal transfer coefficient for workers. So because then here you can see the combination between the re-entry activity for thermal exposure from the also used in the previous calculator, and this activity TSF for the inhalation exposure, which is only for greenhouse use, for re-entry in greenhouse. Okay, this was. I will come back to the beginning to go to the next tab of the calculator, and then we can start one example. So data entry, you need to do it in a chronological order. So first you need to enter the data for the product, or you browse it, or you include it, product. This one I did already. You can choose the formulation type. You see solubles or non-solubles. Okay, I'm interested in this one, no soluble bags. And I want other, not herbicide. Then you see the data appear immediately here. You go on the arrow, you enter the name of the active substance, the concentration, the OL, vapor pressure. You see the default value is 0.001. I do not need to change for this product, for this active. Thermal absorption. Okay, I say that I have experimental data, so I choose, I have this value. Okay, then, and for the next dilution, and 15 for the last dilution tested. And as I'm happy with the default air concentration, I choose not to enter any data for the air concentration calculation because my substance has not such a low vapor pressure, so it will not be a refinement. I can enter, so once I have added my substance, it appears below, as I told you. And then I can choose to enter another active substance, let's say VP3, same concentration, vapor pressure, and same lower thermal absorption. Okay, and I decide oral absorption, no need to modify, it's 100. Molecular weight, I do not need, it is not such a low vapor pressure. And now I'm happy, I have these two active substances. So, okay, no mistake. If I would like to delete the active substance, to modify it, I just need to click on the edit button here or on the bin here to remove it completely. So I go to the next sheet. Okay, the crop. Which crop I'm interested in? I will take low ornamentals. Okay, and you see I choose low ornamentals, and in this case we have few examples, it's just floriculture. I see already some transfer coefficient, but you need first to enter the re-entry activity to have, because of course these are the transfer coefficient for the first activity in the list, but if you were choosing the second one, you see other coefficient would appear related to this activity. Okay, then maximum application rate of the product, I choose 1 kilo of product. Number of application, if I choose, if you see, if there is only one application, the re-entry interval does not appear, while if I choose 2 applications, then I have a re-entry interval. Type of cultivation, it's normal, minimum volume of water. I choose these ones. And then you see that for low ornamentals, we have only downward spraying. And we can have different application techniques, but now I'm interested only in vehicle mounted. You see, I can delete the other one, and if I want, I can include them again. It's very easy. And the buffer strip, I'm okay with 2-3 meters, no drift reduction. So I add this scenario. Once it is added, you see the button becomes red and the scenario I've just entered appears below. I need a second scenario, low. I will choose indoor, so you will see the difference. So indoor, re-entry activity, I can have the same, And I have also the reentry activity for inhalation exposure. General maintenance is of longer duration, while inspection watering is 2 hours. And we can choose the same application rate. 2 application up, you see the interval is appearing. The default is 7, but you can, of course, increase 10 days. Okay. And you have the 2 types of cultivation because it is a greenhouse use. So it can also be a dense cultivation. I can keep both. Minimum volume of water, 100. And the same application techniques. I'm interested only in manual handheld, also for the dense. And I can add my scenario. You see both scenarios that you have entered appear below. Then you go to the next sheet, the intended use. Here you see that you can, as I told you, when you do not have experimental data on dermal absorption, you can change them manually. You can enter like that. And the same for worker. If for worker you have experimental data for the DFR, you can click here and choose to have DFR of 1 instead of 3, depending on the values you obtain from your experimental data. And you have the same for residents. So we hope in the future this could be implemented if different DFR values are identified for resident or bystanders. There will already be the possibility to include them here. At the moment, it's not foreseen, but it's for future developments. Then, if you go to the results, so when you go to the next, to the arrow still, you come back to the first page on data entry, where you see an overview of all the data you have entered, including intended use. And you can go to consult the results. And here in the results, you can generate the report. See, when you generate, it appears below creating report, please wait. So you need to wait. In the meantime, I can show you below. So if you do not choose to navigate specific directly to operator, worker, resident, and bystander, all results anyway are shown below. So you can just scroll down and you will find all of them. So you see here for operator, you see the minimum level of protective equipment needed to have exposure below the AOL. And it seems that for the first active substance I have entered, there is no safe use. I mean, even applying all available protective equipment, exposure is always above the AOL. And you see for the report, now I have the message, report is ready. The download report button is available. So I go and I can download my report, and you see it appears below in the toolbar as a document that you can open and download. And the same, so if you scroll down, you see the combined exposure as well. Then you come to the worker results for one active, for the second active, for both for combined exposure to both active, and the same for resident and bystander. I can show you some report generated. The report generated for this one, it was this one, okay? So when you have the report, it appears like that. My advice is to enter a table of content, an automatic table of content, because then you can easily navigate. You see, the report can be quite long, 63 pages. So if you insert a table of content, you go directly to worker, and you have the result of worker. So at the beginning, you have an overview of the scenario, and then the different results for potential exposure, use of workwear, and gloves. And I think in this one, I wanted to show you for thermal absorption how is the prorata correction, but I do not see it, but okay. Now I can show you another example in the tool. So you see, so when you are done with your product, okay, I go back to the data entry page. Product of the product. Then before starting entering new data, you need to refresh the screen because you cannot start like that. You need to clean it. Okay. And now you can go to data entry and enter your new product. But I would like to download the product I have already saved. This SC could be of interest. So again, you see the overview of the data. So it was also for not an herbicide, but another product category. You see, yes, the value, 2 active substance. And for this one, the active substance number 2, I entered on purpose a very low vapor pressure to show you that this can be taken into account when triggering a lower air concentration. And you see the intended use. Okay, this is the overview of the data. Up. Then we can go to the detailed results. To show you this vapor pressure, I will go to resident and bystander. So you see for adults, here we have different, it was for the second active substance where I put VP. You can see that for vapor, the exposure is to 4 multiplied by 10 minus 7. While for the previous active substance number 1, where the default value was applicable, the exposure to vapor is much higher. So it can work if your vapor pressure is very low, and then the saturated vapor concentration will be low value as well. But otherwise, the refinement will not appear if it's not below the default value. Okay. So this was to show you for the vapor pressure, and I just wanted to show you another example. So I will refresh my screen to download another example. Data entry product. Okay. WG. And you see here it was a wettable granules. It is an herbicide. And we have these different application scenarios. When you go to the summary results, okay, you have chosen the first use. And you see for the workers, there is an error. Missing value where true, false needed. Oh, what happens? When you have such an error message, it is important that you send a feedback to the creator of the calculator by this report new issue. So this button report new issue will allow you to send a mail, and it is always better when you describe the problem that you have encountered, that you also send the zip file. So the product that you have saved earlier, you put it in attachment to the mail, so that the conceptors of the calculator will be able to answer you and to solve your issue. But in this case, I will show you, if you go to data entry of the product, you can see that for this use 3, I forgot to enter the re-entry activity. So it is very important to fill in all the boxes that need to be filled in order to avoid any errors. So this is also useful for you if you cannot wait before having an answer from the creator of the tool that you checked if you have entered correctly all data. So if I go to this use number 3, it was for the application scenario. You can see here, here it was empty. So I go on the right side and I edit it. And if I edit it, okay, I forgot my re-entry activity. It was not applicable, but even when it's not applicable, you need to choose the option to fill in the box. And if I go, I need to add my scenario as it is modified. And I need to go here in the intended use. So once you have made a change in one of the previous data entry and you come to the intended use, you need to refresh. Okay, it's done. Once you have refreshed, then you can go to the summary. And now it should some time to download everything. And now you see for the worker, we have also the results. It's not applicable, so it's great. Okay, so these were some examples. If you have any other question, I hope you could ask them in the chat and that there was time enough to answer to you. Now I will give the floor to Mathilde for the question and answer session. Thank you very much to all for your listening.
Thank you very much, Fred, for this very nice presentation of the OPEX Calculator. So my name is Mathilde, and I'm also working at EFSA as a scientific coordinator in the pesticide unit. We are now approaching the end of the webinar with a Q&A session. As you may have noticed, some questions have been received in the chat box and have already been answered by the contributors during the presentation. In addition, we received a number of questions via the registration form, and some of the most frequently asked questions relevant to the topic, so related to the calculator functionalities and addressed by the contributors, will be presented now. Next slide, please. So the first question is, why are there differences between the exposure values given as output in the scenario summaries at the beginning of the generated report and those included in the appendix? So the difference is the following. In the summary table, all options of protective equipment are presented up to the one that leads to safe use, whereas in the main part and appendix of the report, detailed information is provided only for the first option that leads to safe use. Secondly, it was asked if the report that is generated from running the assessment can be amended to show more significant figures. This will be indeed useful to better address the exposure breakdown needed for more complex assessments or where exposure is low. Indeed, during the drafting of the guidance, the contributors agreed to limit the number of significant digits to what is in the calculator because of the variability within the data and to avoid a spurious extra accuracy. So the following questions is, so in general, the risk assessment for workers for grapes is very challenging due to lack of transfer coefficient values. This could lead indeed to a very conservative estimate of exposure without the possibility of refinements. It was therefore asked if further refinement could be used instead of performing additional studies such as for DFR or dermal absorption. So the reply from the contributors is that for the workers, only dermal absorption, DFR, and DT50 values can be modified by the user. For resident and bystander, in addition to refine DFR and DT50 values, drift reduction and increased buffer zone can also be applied to reduce the exposure. So the next question is how the cumulative risk assessment is calculated. Is it simply the sum of two exposures, like for the hazard quotient index? So for the cumulative risk assessment, the individual hazard quotients are calculated for all active substances in the product by dividing the individual exposure levels by the respective systemic AOL. The hazard index is the sum of the individual hazard quotients. And in addition, the cumulative risk assessment is performed on a product basis, so when different active substances are present in the same product. Another frequently asked question is about the availability of an offline tool. Indeed, the R-Shiny package is available on Zenodo, but the installation of this package locally is not documented. The availability of such an open source tool for offline use would be very useful, as well as a detailed the installation manual for the most operating systems. So to that question, it was decided that further instructions on how to install the R package locally will be included in the manual on Zenodo. The next comment Thank you. The next comment is how can a report containing all the calculations be generated with the online calculator? The following error message were received by a participant. A report could not be generated and define colon selected. So if the calculator doesn't work, for instance, error message or no report generation, it is recommended to follow a stepwise approach. First, check if all entries are complete, as Fred did in the examples. Then save the product and click on the button Report a New Issue. And this will generate an email where you can attach your zip file and describe the issue. Regarding workers, for some crops, the worker does not enter the field until harvesting. So in this case, DFR should be adjusted based on the DT50 value. Therefore, we will expect that the model to ask for pre-harvest interval to calculate the adjusted DFR value, which is not the case. So indeed, in the model, there is no possibility to enter an interval before re-entry, but the model automatically calculates the safe re-entry interval, taking into account the DT50 value. The next question is how can the tool be used efficiently if one is working on it discontinuously, and how to avoid losing data entries already submitted. A 10-minute timeout during data entries is quite inefficient, especially if it's not possible to store the data in between. So if you cannot work continuously, as also replied in the chat box, it is recommended to regularly save your product in a zip file, and the timeout will be extended a little bit more by about 20-30 minutes. Finally, as a last question, how to ensure that user tracking is compliant with personal data protection? On the login page, there is the following text. Which is by signing in, you agree with the term of use. You can click on the term of use to see what you are agreeing with, and they are in compliance with personal data protection. So this is the end of the Q&A session. I hope this was clear, and I now give back the floor to Ariana for the last points.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. So we are now approaching the end of this event. I hope you enjoyed the webinar and found it useful. Now, some follow-up information are listed in this slide. So I hope we managed to reply to all the questions received in the chat box. Also, many of them were addressed directly by Frederick in the presentation or through the examples, as well by Mathilde with the replies presented right now. But in case you think that some in the scope questions are still pending, please resubmit this question through the Ask EFSA tool in the EFSA website. Then the recording and the slides presented today will be published soon in the EFSA website. I would also like to ask you to fill in the evaluation form you will receive shortly in your inbox in order to collect your feedback for possible improvement for the future webinars. Next slide, please. So, and the very last information before closing the event, I would like to take this opportunity to inform you that EFSA is going to organize an event still in the area of non-dietary exposure to plant protection products. In particular, a workshop with stakeholders is organized on the 28th of March with the aim to discuss information, data, as well as the needs for the next update of the OPEX guidance and calculator. You can find the announcement in the EFSA website, so interested stakeholders are invited to register to the event and also to fill in the survey that you will find in the announcement. So with this survey, we will try to gather all the relevant information that should be discussed at the event. So it's very important you fill in the survey in preparation of this event. And with this announcement, I close now the webinar. Thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, Mathilde. Thank you to the contributors that supported us with the questions and answers. Thank you to the events colleagues and to Service Desk for the support. And also thanks a lot to all the attendees for your participation and for the interest in this event. And with this, I close the event and I wish you a nice rest of the day. Goodbye.